Okay, so I'm going to talk about different options for large-scale mapping of urban lighting. It's not going to be an exhaustive list, but it's going to hopefully give a flavour to some of the different things that we're looking at. And hopefully it's going to promote a bit of a discussion about this at the end of the session as well. So we've already heard in the last couple of days about different positive and negative effects of lighting. I think it's important to kind of keep restating that it's there's a huge diversity, and a lot of these conflicts take place in the same place at the same time, or maybe over different times. So trying to get a performance, trying to develop some sort of metric for whether lighting is sustainable or not is very difficult because it's often very subjective and heavily context dependent. So really, we can't say that a lamp is sustainable or not. It may simultaneously support or impair the delivery of particular sustainability goals. So just to give a very quick couple of examples, we've got security lighting, which many people will say has some positive benefits socially, which obviously are debatable, but so there's a positive benefit. And here's a photograph of my hotel room a couple of months ago, and that was what I consider to be useless lighting. That's a security light that was positioned to come directly into my hotel room. So socially, there's positives and negatives. In terms of driving, there's some evidence that blue-rich lighting can improve alertness, but also we know that lamps can cause glare, so you can get dazzled by street lights and oncoming cars. And in terms of wildlife, or in this case agriculture and fisheries, lighting can be very useful if you're a squid fisherman. And also if you're working agriculture and you need to control pests, maybe in certain situations, or monitor pests. So just got to remember that we've got to keep an open mind on these positive and negative effects. But of course, we're here to think about ecological impacts, and we've got some well-known species that tend to be impacted by lighting. And much more broadly, we're thinking about impacts on ecological communities. There's lots of various different projects and guidance that's available. So we're starting to get a better idea about what some of those impacts are. I think we've got a huge diversity of people here today, but I think we all have a shared goal, really, which is better management of the lighting, which I think needs to be more holistic management of the nighttime environment. We know there's some impacts. We've got some ideas about mitigation, which we've heard already today. But mitigation needs to draw on and influence a range of different areas. And I think it's important just to structure this so that obviously we need to know what the ecological impacts are from species, habitat perspective, different scales, different contexts, whether that's an urban or rural habitat, and thresholds. But also we need to really understand about lighting characteristics, and Emma was talking about that earlier, the different aspects of lighting. We need to become really familiar with those. We've heard a couple of things today and yesterday about the cultural aspects as well, about what's typical practice, what's normal, what's expected, whether people feel comfortable with certain types of lighting. But we also need to think about the lighting infrastructures that are in place now, different types of lighting, but also the configurations. And linked to that is obviously understanding, having information on spatial and temporal lighting. We also need to make the links across. So to understand ecological impacts, we need to understand about the different types of lighting characteristics. And to understand a little bit about cultural aspects of lighting, it may be helpful to look at spatial and temporal data sets. So I'm going to be talking about spatial lighting data, but hopefully it's relevant to all of these. So baseline mapping of lighting could be really important for a variety of reasons. It might help us identify the need for action. It might help us estimate the magnitudes of any impacts. It could be really useful for targeting that mitigation in the whole landscape. And also, which is something that I think has come up a couple of times, this issue of what happens 10 years later. Has the lighting changed? And maybe has the keyboard disappeared? So yeah, has that lighting mitigation succeeded now? But also, 10 years' time, is it still in place, or has there been some sort of lighting creep? So basically, if we know a species is sensitive to a particular type of lighting, a question might be, in what parts of the landscape are those conflicts occurring? We need to think about, in terms of the lighting data that's available, the kind of the spatial grain and extent of that lighting data, whether it's consistent within a particular data set or over time, whether it can be gathered in a repeatable manner, and most importantly to us, whether it's ecologically relevant. And also about availability. It's no good having these data sets if it's only available to a NASA spy or NASA spy satellite, or it's very expensive, or it's useful for researchers but not practitioners. So we know that there's a lot of lighting data available for urban areas, and lots of different opportunities provided by this, but there are also limitations, and we need to be clear about what those are. I'm focusing on cities because I live in cities, and they tend to be heavily lit. So it might be that the impacts are greater here. It might be that they're easier to detect. But they're also very heavily surveyed. So you're more likely to get lighting data for a large city than a field, necessarily. And also you tend to get layers of data for cities, which can be compared. But also cities are changing in form and function, and we're building new cities even in the UK, apparently. So you've seen some of these before. This is the sort of data you might be able to download. You can download from, this is satellite-based data. I'm not going to discuss the acronyms because I can't remember them, but you've got DMSP data and the VIIRS data, and basically looks the same at this spatial extent, for example. These are global data sets, obviously just displaying it for the UK here. But I've zoomed in on London. The DMSP data is free to download. The resolution is quite coarse, so you can't necessarily link a particular hotspot to a particular lighting installation. It's actually pretty good historical data. I think it goes back to 92. So you can it is possible to make comparisons between the years, but there's no internal, there's no rate, not radiance calibrated. VIIRS data is more recent. We've got it, VIIRS data for 2 or 3 years. It's also free to download. The resolution is much better, so you can start to see some differentiation there within London. And it's radiance calibrated, so we can link, we've got a better idea of the radiant emissions. So each of those pixels has a value, and that can be related to something that's real. Although you've got to be very careful about what the bandwidth is, because I'm pretty sure it doesn't include the lower levels of visible light, blue light. So there's an issue there, but it's very useful data, I think. So then we get on to some more. So I'm gradually it's going to become finer and finer spatial resolution here. So the next step is to look at photography from the ISS. You've probably seen these kind of images from tweeted by various astronauts. But they're literally taking photographs out the window with a camera. It's a very good camera, but it's a digital SLR. And as you can see there, for London, you can see the variation in the quality there within London. These are free to download. When you zoom in, you'll notice that you can see rivers, for example, see the Thames, but the spatial resolution is still pretty coarse. Single image, and it's a color image. It's not calibrated, so you can compare, I suppose, different parts of that image to look at what the brightest bits of London are, for example, but it's more difficult to compare images over time. And astronauts tend to focus on big cities or the villages they come from. They take a lot of photographs of certain areas. So when you compare this to aerial night photography, which has been heavily plugged, I think, through this conference, you can see the resolution could be better. And so I'll just talk about that. So this is something I've been involved in a little bit, commissioning various different aerial photography, aerial photographs of cities. It involves flying backwards and forwards across the target city, taking hundreds of color photographs, very high spatial resolution, what we did was we did some ground truthing to try and actually give these, to try and recalibrate the images. But we also did some GIS processing to extract the locations of individual lamps. I won't go into any more details, but we've got a paper in PLOS One, and also our colleagues in Germany published a similar paper on Berlin. So it's possible to get whole cities, but it's very labor intensive to do this. Data's free from our colleagues in Berlin, but we're pretty tight, so you've got to purchase the data from the Environment Agency. And in the UK, we've got data for the following cities and market towns. But I think this data's got a variety of uses. Some of them are purely to do with engagement of the public, and you know, when I'm trying to explain to my mother-in-law what I'm doing for a job, it can be very difficult. I think that was her question anyway. But when you present images like this, then suddenly it becomes very engaging, and people start noticing where they live. And there's a lot of assumptions that street lighting is mostly, well, lighting is mostly associated with the streets, but then you start to realise there's maybe other sources of emissions. So here's some factories which have skylights which they're not closing at night. So it doesn't necessarily solve anything, but it starts to raise some interesting questions. And that's just a nice picture of St. Paul's Cathedral. Okay, so zooming down further, I mentioned we can extract lamp locations from this kind of data, but also local authorities have data on streetlights. And once you've got street lighting data, you can then start to model luminance and lumens, for example, based on that. So there's software available, and we also, Kevin, in his presentation yesterday, presented some images that were, I think, modeled using R software. And so that becomes very, very accurate then. It's also possible to interpolate measurements based on, interpolate ground measurements. But that's obviously very labor intensive, because you literally got to go and measure the whole landscape with a radiometer. We've got sky quality meters and the types of light meters that can be used to measure sky quality, star visibility. And there's also an app that's being used by quite a lot of people, so it's kind of a citizen science approach. So that's another way of getting an idea of a different type of light pollution and how that might change over time. So we need to make really good use of this landscape data. Again, linking to what Emma was talking about, we need to try and find a way of linking the remote sensing data to something that's meaningful ecologically, and then something that can be used by practitioners. That's a real challenge. Do our lighting metrics match? So there's a lot of work to do, really, but we need to think about, I think we need to, particularly in ecology, when we're thinking about landscape processes, we need to scale up our research from small-scale studies, which are valid ecologically, to something at a larger scale, which is useful for conservation. There's only 2 slides on this, but what we tried to do is take some of our nighttime aerial photography and then use that to understand landscape scale implications, ecological implications of lighting. So I'm not going to go into any detail on this, but I'm happy to talk about it later. But basically, we undertook some field surveys of Australis, and we related the probability of crossing to various different measures, including lux, which we measured on the ground. But then, because we've got this aerial night photograph, which we've calibrated, converted to a measure of lux, we were then able to extrapolate these field surveys, the models that derive from the field surveys, to actually estimate landscape habitat connectivity for this species across an entire city. And I think one of the things that this could do is actually start to identify opportunities for practical mitigation, so dimming lights in certain areas, but also increasing the structural connectivity of vegetation. So it's clear that ecological impacts can be highly context specific, and for some types of mitigation, baseline mapping of lighting could be very useful. There's a lot of data out there that's available for free. But I think we really need to have more discussion between practitioners and researchers about what's appropriate. We need to make sure that our metrics are relevant to target species and lighting engineers, whilst also possible able to estimate these impacts over large spatial scales. And I'd like to just thank our field assistants, some of whom are in the audience, our funding bodies, and just flag up our project. Thanks a lot.